Picture this. A weathered hand trembles as it holds a cream-colored envelope, fingertips tracing over the unfamiliar return address in the corner. Thomas Reeves, retired Marine Corps sergeant, stands frozen in his modest kitchen, the morning light streaming through half-drawn blinds. The coffee in his favorite mug, the one with the faded Marine Corps emblem, grows cold as his eyes remain fixed on the letter. 67 years old, with steel-gray hair and a posture that still commands respect, despite the slight curve in his spine from years of carrying both visible and invisible weights. The envelope bears a postmark from a city 2,000 miles away, a place he hasn't thought about in nearly 15 years. A place where nightmares were born and heroes were made, though Thomas would never use that word for himself. "To the Marine who saved my life in Fallujah," reads the careful script. Below his name, Thomas sinks into his kitchen chair, the wood creaking beneath him like the joints in his body. His therapy dog Max, a patient German shepherd, nudges his knee with a concerned whine. The ticking of the wall clock seems to grow louder, marking the minutes Thomas spends staring at this unexpected bridge to his past. "Who are you?" he whispers to the envelope, his voice barely audible. After all this time, his heart races with the same intensity it did during those harrowing days in Iraq, when every shadow held potential threats and every decision carried life or death consequences. The return address offers no name, just a street number and apartment in Boston, Massachusetts. Thomas runs his thumb under the sealed flap, then hesitates. Some doors to the past are better left closed. Some memories better left buried in the sand. And yet, the phone rings, startling him. His daughter calling for their weekly check-in. Thomas sets the letter down, promising himself he'll open it after the call. Little did he know that the contents of that envelope would unravel a connection so profound, so unexpected, that it would not only change his life, but ripple through an entire community. Let me take you back to where it all began. Thomas Reeves had always been a man defined by duty. Growing up on a small farm in rural Ohio, he learned the value of hard work before he could even reach the pedals on his father's tractor. By 12, he was up before dawn, tending to animals and helping with harvests. His mother often said he was born with an old soul, carrying responsibility as naturally as other children carried toys. After high school, when many of his classmates headed to college or took jobs at the local factory, Thomas enlisted in the Marines. "Some people are called to serve," he told his worried parents. "I can't explain it better than that." Through 22 years of service, 4 deployments, and countless missions, Thomas built a reputation as the steady center in any storm. His fellow Marines called him the Oak, unwavering, reliable, the one you wanted beside you when everything went sideways. He wasn't the loudest or the fastest, but he was the one who noticed everything, who remembered the details that saved lives. "Reeves has eyes in the back of his head," his commanding officer once remarked after Thomas spotted an IED that everyone else had missed. His greatest strength was his ability to remain calm in chaos. While others froze or panicked, Thomas's mind cleared, his focus sharpened. This gift had saved dozens of lives over his career, including those under his command, and countless civilians caught in crossfires not of their making. After retiring from the Marines with honors, including 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, Thomas returned to civilian life with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his service. He bought a modest 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Mapleton, a small town in southern Illinois where the corn grew tall and neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill. His home became his sanctuary, simple but meticulously maintained, with a vegetable garden in the back that produced the sweetest tomatoes in the county. The walls held only a few photographs: his parents on their 50th anniversary, his daughter Sarah on her college graduation day, and one group photo of his final unit in Iraq, their arms around each other's shoulders, exhausted smiles beneath dust-caked faces. Thomas kept his military honors in a box in his closet rather than on display. The work was its own reward, he would say on the rare occasions when someone asked about his service. He preferred conversations about gardening techniques or his growing collection of hand-carved wooden birds, a hobby he'd taken up to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied during the long, sometimes too quiet evenings. The townspeople of Mapleton respected Thomas's privacy while embracing him as one of their own. He volunteered at the local VA center twice a week, teaching woodworking to younger veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. On Memorial Day, he quietly placed flags on the graves of fallen service members at the town cemetery, arriving before dawn and leaving before the official ceremonies began. It was during one of his volunteer sessions at the VA that Thomas first noticed Elijah Warner. The young man stood in the doorway of the workshop, observing the class with sharp, assessing eyes. Something about his stance, Weight distributed evenly, back straight, gaze constantly scanning, marked him as military, though he wore civilian clothes and had grown his hair longer than regulation would allow. "You can just watch today," Thomas offered, gesturing to an empty chair. "No pressure to participate." The young man nodded, but didn't sit. "Just getting the lay of the land," he replied, his voice carrying a faint accent Thomas couldn't quite place. Middle Eastern, perhaps. Thomas returned to demonstrating a dovetail joint to a Marine who'd lost 3 fingers on his right hand and was learning to work with the limitations of a prosthetic. When he looked up again, the visitor was gone. Thomas didn't think much of it. Many veterans circled around programs several times before feeling comfortable enough to join. 2 days later, Thomas was startled to find the same young man sitting on a bench outside his house, apparently waiting for him to return from grocery shopping. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, standing as Thomas approached with bags in both hands. "I'm Elijah Warner. I was hoping we could talk." Thomas studied him carefully. Up close, he appeared to be in his early 30s, with olive skin and dark eyes that held an intensity Thomas recognized, the hypervigilance that many veterans never fully shed. "Let me put these groceries away," Thomas replied evenly. "Then we can talk on the porch if you'd like." Elijah nodded, following at a respectful distance. "I can help with those," he offered, reaching for one of the bags. "I've got it," Thomas said, not unkindly, but firmly. He didn't know this man, or his intentions, and years of training had taught him caution. "There's water in the cooler on the porch if you're thirsty." Inside his kitchen, Thomas placed the bags on the counter and took a moment to center himself. His service pistol was locked in the safe in his bedroom. Not that he expected to need it, but the presence of an unexpected visitor triggered old instincts. Instead, he filled 2 glasses with lemonade and carried them outside. Elijah sat on the porch swing, his posture too rigid to suggest relaxation. He accepted the lemonade with a nod of thanks but didn't drink. "How can I help you, Mr. Warner?" Thomas asked, settling into his rocking chair. "I'm writing a book," Elijah said, directly, "about Iraq. Specifically, Fallujah, 2004. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the beginning of the constriction that often preceded his panic attacks. He focused on his breathing, the technique his therapist had taught him. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. "There are plenty of books about Fallujah already," Thomas replied after composing himself. "Written by people who were there." "I was there," Elijah countered, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "Not as a soldier. As a child." The tightness in Thomas's chest intensified. In his mind, he could suddenly hear the chaos: gunfire, explosions, shouted orders, and crying children. Always the children, the ones who haunted him most. "I'm looking for first-hand accounts from Marines who participated in Operation Phantom Fury," Elijah continued, "particularly those who had interactions with civilians caught in the fighting." Thomas set his lemonade down, the glass making a sharp sound against the wooden table. "I don't talk about that time," he said firmly. "Not to family, not to other veterans, and certainly not for a book." "I understand your reluctance," Elijah pressed, "but this is important historical documentation. The civilian perspective is rarely captured accurately, and the military perspective is usually sanitized for public consumption. I'm trying to present the full, complex truth." "The truth," Thomas echoed, a bitter edge to his voice. "Everyone wants the truth until they hear it. Then they want the version that lets them sleep at night." Elijah leaned forward. "I'm not looking for comfort, Sergeant Reeves. I'm looking for reality. Your reality, as you lived it." The use of his rank startled Thomas. He hadn't introduced himself that way at the VA, where he was simply Thomas, or sometimes Mr. Reeves to the younger veterans. "You've been researching me," Thomas stated. "Of course," Elijah admitted without apology. "Your unit was positioned in the sector where my family lived. Based on dates and locations, I believe you might have information relevant to my research." Thomas stood, indicating the conversation was over. "I wish you luck with your book, Mr. Warner, but I won't be contributing to it." Elijah didn't move. "I'll be staying at the Mapleton Inn for the next 2 weeks. Here's my card if you change your mind." He placed a business card on the table and finally took a sip of lemonade. "This is excellent, by the way. Thank you for your hospitality." After Elijah left, Thomas sat alone on his porch until sunset, the untouched business card a persistent reminder of memories he'd spent years learning to contain. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. Buildings in flames, the acrid smell of smoke, and worse, the weight of a child in his arms. Over the next week, Thomas spotted Elijah around town several times, at the diner having breakfast, at the library poring over old newspapers, once even at the VA speaking with some of the younger veterans. Each time, Elijah acknowledged him, with a respectful nod, but made no further approach. Thomas found himself increasingly unsettled by the young man's presence. At his weekly therapy session at the VA, he finally mentioned the encounter to Dr. Reynolds, the psychologist he'd been seeing for the past 5 years. "He's stirring up things I've worked hard to process and put in perspective," Thomas admitted. "Just seeing him around town brings it all back." Dr. Reynolds adjusted her glasses thoughtfully. "You've made tremendous progress with your PTSD, Thomas. But progress doesn't mean these experiences no longer affect you. It means you've developed tools to live with them. The tools don't seem to be working so well lately," Thomas confessed. "The nightmares are back, and yesterday when a car backfired outside the grocery store, I found myself on the ground before I even realized what I was doing." "Have you considered that speaking with this young man might actually be beneficial?" Dr. Reynolds suggested carefully. "Sometimes confronting specific triggers in a controlled way can help reduce their power over us." Thomas frowned. "You think I should talk to him about Fallujah?" "I think you should consider whether your resistance is protecting you or limiting you," she replied. "You've told me many times that one of your biggest regrets is not knowing what happened to the civilians you encountered. This might be an opportunity to fill in some of those blanks." Thomas left the session unconvinced but thoughtful. That evening, as he worked in his garden, he was startled by Max's alert bark, followed by the sound of footsteps on gravel. He looked up to see Sarah, his daughter, walking up the driveway with a weekend bag slung over her shoulder. "Surprise inspection?" she called out cheerfully. At 32, Sarah had her mother's warm smile and Thomas's steady determination. After finishing her nursing degree, she'd taken a job at a hospital in Chicago, a 3-hour drive that felt much longer to Thomas. "This is unexpected," Thomas said, embracing her with soil-covered hands. "Is everything okay?" Sarah pulled back, studying his face. "That's what I came to ask you. You sounded off during our call on Sunday, and you missed our Tuesday check-in." "Entirely." Thomas winced. "I forgot to call. I'm sorry. Dad, you haven't missed a Tuesday call in 3 years. Not even when you had that flu and could barely speak." Sarah picked up his gardening tools and started putting them away, a habit from childhood when she'd helped him with chores. "So, what's going on?" Over dinner, Thomas told her about Elijah, Warner, and his request. Sarah listened without interrupting, a skill she'd developed as both a daughter of a man who rarely shared his feelings, and as a nurse who knew the value of patience. "Have you looked him up?" she asked when he finished. "Verified his story?" Thomas shook his head. "I haven't wanted to engage with it at all." Sarah pulled out her phone. "Well, let's see what we can find." Her fingers moved quickly over the screen. "Elijah Warner. Here he is. Journalist, author of 2 previous books on Middle Eastern conflicts, graduated from Columbia Journalism School. Looks legitimate, Dad." She turned the phone to show him a professional headshot of Elijah on a publisher's website. "It says here his family emigrated from Iraq in 2005. He was a child during the Second Battle of Fallujah." Sarah continued reading. "His first book was about refugee experiences. Got good reviews." Thomas pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. "Just because he's a legitimate journalist doesn't mean I want to dredge up those memories for his book." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't owe him your story, Dad. But from what you've told me about that time, the little you've shared, I know you still carry questions. Maybe he has answers." Thomas squeezed her hand, then released it. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," she replied with a soft smile. "One who showed me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's necessary despite the fear." The next morning, Thomas found Elijah at the diner, sitting in a booth with a laptop and papers spread before him. Without waiting for an invitation, Thomas slid into the seat across from him. "I have conditions," Thomas said without preamble. "I'll talk to you, but on my terms." Elijah closed his laptop immediately, giving Thomas his full attention. "I'm listening. No recording devices, no direct quotes. You can take notes, but I review what you write about our conversations, and I can stop at any time, no questions asked." Elijah considered these requirements, then nodded. "Agreed. When would you like to begin?" "Now," Thomas said, surprising himself almost as much as Elijah. "But not here. There's a place I go sometimes by the river. We can talk there." 20 minutes later, they sat on a fallen log overlooking the Mapleton River, the water moving sluggishly in the summer heat. Thomas had discovered this spot shortly after moving to town, drawn to the solitude and the soothing sound of flowing water. "Before I start," Thomas said, "I need to know something. You said your family was in Fallujah during the battle. Did everyone survive?" Elijah's expression remained carefully neutral. My parents and younger sister survived. My older brother did not. Thomas nodded, absorbing this information. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Elijah replied formally. But that's not why I'm here. This isn't about seeking personal closure. It's about documenting history from multiple perspectives. Thomas wasn't entirely convinced, but he appreciated the professional distance Elijah was attempting to maintain. It made what he was about to do slightly easier. Fallujah was hell, Thomas began, his voice low and steady. Not the religious hell of fire and brimstone, but the human hell we create for each other. We went in with orders and objectives that made sense on paper, in briefing rooms far from the reality on the ground. The reality was a city of civilians caught between insurgents who used them as shields and a military force trained to eliminate threats. Once Thomas started speaking, the memories flowed more easily than he expected. He described the house-to-house fighting, the constant tension of not knowing who was an enemy combatant and who was an innocent bystander. He spoke of the impossible decisions made in split seconds, the weight of life and death in every moment. There was this one day, Thomas said, his eyes focused on the middle distance. We were clearing houses on Al-Janin Street. Each building was supposed to be empty. Civilians had been ordered to evacuate. But in the sixth house, we found a family hiding in a back room. Father, mother, 3 children. The youngest couldn't have been more than 4. Thomas paused, taking a deep breath. Beside him, Elijah remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might break the spell of remembrance. They were terrified, huddled together in a corner. The father kept saying something in Arabic, holding his hands up. Our interpreter had been injured earlier, so I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. Don't hurt my family. Thomas picked up a stick and absently drew patterns in the dirt at his feet. Protocol said to detain them, call it in, wait for someone to come escort them to the civilian collection point. But there was heavy fighting 2 blocks over. No one was coming anytime soon, and we couldn't just leave them there with the battle moving closer. Elijah jotted something in his notebook. What did you do? I made a call. Sent most of my squad to continue the mission. Stayed behind with 1 other Marine to escort the family to safety ourselves. Thomas's jaw tightened. My commanding officer wasn't happy about it afterward. Said I compromised the mission, and maybe he was right, from a strictly military perspective. But you saved that family, Elijah pointed out. Thomas looked at him directly. Did I? I led them through 4 blocks of urban warfare with bullets flying and buildings burning around us. The father was hit in the shoulder when we were almost there. I carried their youngest while his mother helped her husband walk. We made it to the collection point, handed them over to the medical team, and went back to our unit. He shook his head. I never knew what happened to them after that. Whether they all survived, where they went. For years I've wondered. Elijah was writing rapidly now. Do you remember the family's name? Thomas closed his eyes, reaching back through the layers of memory. The father introduced himself when we were moving. Al-something. Al-Samari. Al-Sabari. It was chaotic, and my focus was on keeping them alive, not remembering names. They talked for nearly 3 hours, the sun rising high overhead. Thomas recounted several other incidents involving civilians, each story delivered in the same measured tone, though Elijah noted the subtle signs of emotional strain, the tightening around his eyes, the occasional pause to collect himself. As their first session concluded, Elijah closed his notebook. Thank you for sharing this, Sergeant Reeves. Would you be willing to meet again tomorrow? Thomas stood, stretching his stiff legs. I have VA duty in the morning. Afternoon would work. 2 o'clock, same place? Elijah suggested. Thomas nodded, then hesitated. You said you were a child in Fallujah. How much do you actually remember? A shadow crossed Elijah's face. More than I wish I did, less than I probably should. Trauma does strange things to memory, as I'm sure you know. It was the first personal comment Elijah had made, a tiny crack in his professional facade. Thomas recognized it as the offering it was, a small exchange for the vulnerability Thomas had shown. Until tomorrow then, Thomas said, and headed back toward town, feeling both drained and somehow lighter. Their meetings continued daily for the next week. Thomas found himself sharing details he had never vocalized before. The smell of the city, the weight of his gear in the oppressive heat, the way certain sounds or expressions remained engraved in his memory while other potentially important details had faded completely. Elijah proved to be a skilled interviewer, knowing when to press for more information and when to allow silence. Gradually, their conversations expanded beyond the strict parameters of the book research. Thomas learned that Elijah had come to the United States as a refugee at age 13, had struggled with English initially but had eventually excelled academically, and had chosen journalism as a way to give voice to those whose stories often went untold. My father wanted me to Become a doctor, Elijah admitted during one of their breaks. He said America needs more Arab doctors to show that we heal, not harm. But I couldn't. The sight of blood still triggers flashbacks. It was the most personal revelation Elijah had offered, and Thomas recognized the significance of the trust being extended. My father wanted me to take over the family farm, Thomas shared in return. He never understood why I enlisted, not until years later, when he told me he was proud of the man I'd become, even if it wasn't the path he would have chosen. On their 7th meeting, Elijah arrived with a folder tucked under his arm. His expression was different, more intense, almost nervous. I have something to show you, he said without preamble as they took their usual seats by the river. Based on the dates and locations you've described, I've been cross-referencing with refugee records and interviews I've conducted for previous projects. He opened the folder and removed a photograph, handing it to Thomas. It showed a family standing outside a tent in what appeared to be a refugee camp. Father, mother, 2 boys, and a little girl. The father's arm was in a sling. This is the al-Samari family, Elijah said quietly, photographed at the Al-Habaniya refugee camp in December 2004. Thomas stared at the image, his heart pounding. They made it out, he whispered. All of them. They did, Elijah confirmed. According to the records, the father, Yasir al-Samari, had a gunshot wound to his right shoulder but recovered fully. They were eventually resettled in Sweden in 2006. Thomas traced the faces in the photograph with a gentle finger. The youngest child, the one he had carried through the streets of Fallujah, appeared to be about 4 or 5, with large dark eyes and a solemn expression. Her name is Samira, Elijah said, watching Thomas closely. She would be in her 20s now. Thank you for finding this, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. Not knowing what happened to them, it's been one of the hardest parts. Elijah hesitated, then reached back into his folder. There's something else. Something I should have told you from the beginning, but I needed to be sure first. He removed another photograph, this one older and creased from handling. It showed a Marine in full combat gear, kneeling beside a small dark-haired boy of about 10. They were surrounded by rubble, the sky behind them filled with smoke. This is you, isn't it? Elijah asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Thomas took the photograph with a trembling hand. Where did you get this? It belonged to my father, Elijah said softly. The boy in the picture is me. The world seemed to tilt beneath Thomas as the implications of Elijah's words registered. He looked from the photograph to Elijah's face, searching for the child in the man. Your family, you were not the Al-Samaris, Elijah clarified quickly. But yes, my family was among those you helped evacuate. Not on Al-Janin Street, but 3 days later, near the market district. Our home had been destroyed in an airstrike. You found us sheltering in the basement of my uncle's shop. Thomas's mind raced through fragmented memories. A crowded basement, the acrid smell of smoke and fear, a shopkeeper with a badly broken leg, a boy who spoke some English helping to translate. You were the one who knew English, Thomas said slowly. You told me your father taught languages at the university. Elijah nodded, a smile breaking through his professional demeanor for the first time. You remembered. Your father couldn't walk. I had my squad mate radio for a medical evacuation. Thomas's eyes widened in sudden realization. Your brother, you said he didn't survive. Elijah's smile faded. Tariq, he was 17. He went back to help another family escape, and was caught in a firefight between Marines and insurgents. We didn't learn what happened to him until weeks later. I'm so sorry, Thomas said, the words feeling woefully inadequate. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? I needed to hear your recollections unclouded by knowledge of our connection, Elijah explained, and selfishly perhaps, I wanted to know if you remembered us, remembered me without prompting. My family has never forgotten you. Thomas studied the photograph again. How did you find me? After all these years? It wasn't easy, Elijah admitted. The photograph doesn't show your full name tag, just Reeves. I've been researching Marine units that were in Fallujah for years, trying to narrow down possibilities. When I finally identified your unit, I still had to determine which Reeves you were, and whether you were still alive. When I learned you were living in Mapleton, I knew I had to come in person. For your book, Thomas said, understanding. Now why this project meant so much to Elijah. The book is real, Elijah assured him. But yes, finding you was personal as well as professional. My father made me promise before he died that I would try to locate the Marine with kind eyes, as he called you, to thank you. He said that, in the darkest moment of our lives, you showed us that humanity can survive even in hell. Thomas felt tears welling in his eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. He blinked them back, swallowing hard against the tightness in his throat. "I was just doing my job," he said, the words automatic. Elijah shook his head. "No. Your job was to clear buildings and secure the area, risking your safety to help civilians go beyond duty. My father understood that. So do I." For several minutes, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling around them. The river continued its patient journey beside them, indifferent to human revelations. "I have one more thing to show you," Elijah finally said, reaching into his folder a third time. He withdrew an envelope and handed it to Thomas. "This is from my mother. When I told her I had finally found you, she insisted on writing this. She's never fully mastered English, so my sister helped with the translation." Thomas accepted the envelope, holding it much as he had held Elijah's business card that first day, as if it might contain something volatile. "Would you mind if I read this privately?" "Of course," Elijah said, standing. "Take all the time you need. I'll be at the inn if you want to talk afterward." After Elijah left, Thomas sat by the river for nearly an hour, the unopened letter in his hands. Finally, with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. The letter, written in elegant script, began formally, but quickly transformed into something deeply personal. A mother's account of the day her family was saved by a stranger, the long journey from refugee camp to resettlement in Boston, the constant presence of Thomas in their family's stories and prayers. It described how Elijah had grown up hearing about Sergeant Reeves with the kind eyes, how finding Thomas had become his quiet obsession, alongside his more public work documenting the civilian experience of war. "My husband lived long enough to see our son graduate from university," the letter concluded. His last words to Elijah were a reminder to never forget those who helped us when we had nothing. "If you are reading this, it means my son has fulfilled his promise. Our family's circle is complete. You are and have always been part of our story. We would be honored to become part of yours." It was signed simply, "With eternal gratitude, Fatima Warner, formerly Fatima Al-Kazimi." Thomas carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. Then, for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to weep openly, not from grief or trauma, but from a profound sense of completion he hadn't known he was missing. The revelation of Thomas and Elijah's connection spread quickly through Mapleton. What began as private reconciliation with the past became a story that captivated the small community and, eventually, a much wider audience. Sarah was the first to recognize the broader significance. "Dad, this isn't just about you and Elijah," she insisted during one of her increasingly frequent visits. "This is about healing the divisions that war creates. People need to hear this story." Thomas was reluctant at first. "I'm a private person, Sarah. You know that." "I do," she acknowledged. "But sometimes private people are called to public purposes." She smiled at his raised eyebrow. "Your words, from one of your letters when I was struggling in nursing school." With Thomas's cautious blessing, Elijah's book project evolved. What had begun as a historical documentation of civilian experiences in Fallujah expanded to include the story of reconnection 15 years later. Elijah conducted additional interviews with local veterans, many of whom had been inspired by Thomas's example to share their own experiences after years of silence. The town's annual Veterans Day ceremony, usually a modest affair at the local park, became the venue for the first public telling of Thomas and Elijah's story. Standing side by side at the podium, the Marine and the refugee-turned-journalist described their shared history to a hushed audience of townspeople and visitors, drawn by advance coverage in regional newspapers. "War divides us into categories: soldier and civilian, ally and enemy, savior and saved," Elijah said in conclusion. "But beneath these labels, we remain human, connected by acts of compassion that transcend the chaos around us." Thomas, never comfortable with public speaking, kept his remarks brief. "I carried the weight of not knowing for 15 years, he said simply. "Now that weight is gone. If sharing our story helps others put down their own burdens, then making it public is worth the discomfort." The story might have remained a regional interest piece had it not been for the presence of a producer from a national news program in the audience. Captivated by the unlikely reunion, she approached Thomas and Elijah afterward with a proposition for a featured segment. 3 weeks later, Thomas found himself in a Boston studio, cameras and lights trained on him as he described that day in Fallujah. Beside him sat Elijah, and behind them, on a screen visible to the studio audience, appeared a live video feed from Sweden, where the Al-Samari family, the first family Thomas had saved, waited to express their gratitude directly. As the segment aired nationally, then internationally, more stories emerged. A former interpreter recognized Thomas from the broadcast, and reached out with information about other families he had helped evacuate. A Marine who had served under Thomas contacted the network to share how Thomas's example had influenced his own approach to civilian interactions in later deployments. Social media amplified the story's reach. The hashtag #GeoKindnessInChaos began trending, with thousands sharing their own experiences of unexpected compassion during times of conflict. Veterans organizations reported increased participation in support programs, with many citing Thomas and Elijah's story as inspiration to seek help with their own war-related trauma. For Thomas, the most meaningful outcome was the unexpected healing it brought to his own community. Several of Mapleton's residents, themselves veterans of various conflicts, began meeting informally to share experiences they had previously kept private. The town council approved funding for an expanded veterans support program at the local community center, with Thomas reluctantly agreeing to serve as an advisor. Elijah's book, eventually titled The Marine with Kind Eyes, Finding Humanity in War, was published 18 months after his first appearance on Thomas's porch. The first copy, bound in leather, was presented to Thomas at a small gathering of friends and family in his backyard. "Open it," Elijah urged, as Thomas held the book with uncharacteristic hesitation. Inside the cover, Thomas found handwritten messages, not just from Elijah and his mother, but from dozens of people whose lives had intersected with his over the years, many of whom he had never expected to hear from again. "How did you find all these people?" Thomas asked, visibly moved. Elijah smiled. "I'm an investigative journalist, remember? Finding people is what I do." The book became a bestseller, not just for its unflinching portrayal of war's impact on civilians, but for its message of reconciliation and healing. Thomas declined most interview requests, preferring to let Elijah serve as the public face of their story. But he did agree to occasional speaking engagements at veterans events, where his quiet authority carried particular weight. 1 year after the reunion that had changed both their lives, Thomas and Elijah stood together at the dedication of a new memorial in Mapleton's Central Park. Unlike traditional war memorials, this one honored not just fallen soldiers, but the civilians caught in conflicts around the world, and the acts of compassion that had transcended battle lines. The simple stone marker bore a quote selected by Thomas. "In the chaos of war, humanity survives through individual acts of courage and compassion." Below, a bronze plaque told the story of a Marine and a boy whose paths crossed in Fallujah and reconnected years later in a small Illinois town. As the small crowd dispersed after the ceremony, Thomas and Elijah remained, studying the memorial in companionable silence. "My mother is coming to visit next month," Elijah said eventually. "She's never been to Illinois." Thomas nodded. "She's welcome to stay at my place. The guest room is small, but comfortable. She'll insist on cooking for you," Elijah warned with a smile. "Preparing food for others is her love language." "I look forward to it," Thomas replied, meaning it. In the past year, his house had gradually filled with new photographs. Elijah and his family, the Alsamaris in Sweden, gatherings of veterans and their families at his barbecues. His sanctuary had expanded to include connections he had never expected to make. As the sun set over Mapleton, casting long shadows across the new memorial, Thomas reflected on how a single letter had unraveled the careful isolation he had built around himself. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they no longer held the same power. Each one was now balanced by the knowledge of lives continued, families built, futures secured, at least in part because of choices he had made during humanity's darkest hours. "You know," Thomas said quietly, "for 20 years, I've wondered if anything good could come from what we experienced there, if any meaning could be found in such senseless destruction." Elijah considered this. "I don't think meaning is found," he replied thoughtfully. "I think it's created, through how we choose to carry our experiences forward." Thomas nodded, placing a hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder, the boy he had saved, now the man who had, in turn, saved something in him. "I think you're right," he said, "and I'm grateful our paths crossed again so I could learn that lesson." Together, they walked back toward Thomas's house, where Sarah was preparing dinner, and Max waited patiently at the door. Behind them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in a broken city halfway around the world, now bearing witness to the healing that can sometimes, unexpectedly, emerge from wars. Long shadows. Have you ever been touched by an unexpected connection from your past? Or perhaps you know someone who experienced a life-changing reunion? Share your stories in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible tales of human connection that transcend time and circumstance. Remember, Sometimes the most meaningful relationships in our lives begin in the most unlikely moments.